Take a closer look at the two sides of the same painting. One where the red leaves appear rather dull and flat, and the other where the vivid colors glow with depth and intensity. The only difference is my watercolor technique. And in this tutorial, we'll be painting this amazing plant known as the lobster claw and learning how to tackle one of the biggest watercolor challenges that all beginners face: how to achieve extra vibrant, juicy colors. Now, we all love to paint vibrant watercolor subjects, but here's the twist. Capturing this kind of bold, saturated color with watercolor pigments isn't as easy as it looks, especially when you're working with reds. If you've ever laid down a wash that looked rich and juicy when wet, only to come back and find it pale, dull, or washed out after drying, you're not alone. This common problem is called drying shift, and it happens to everyone, even with the highest end pigments and paper. Watercolor beginners or even more experienced artists, especially those who come from gouache or acrylic background, often find it extremely frustrating. But after years of wrestling with this issue myself, I've developed some simple but powerful techniques that keep my washes luminous and full of life. So in today's video, I'll walk you through exactly how I do it step by step. And as always, for my Patreon subscribers, I will be posting a real-time recording of this tutorial along with outlines and step-by-step photos next month. This will be our July tutorial after I post the last chapter of this big and complex finch and orchids class, where we learned about granulating pigments and also some magnolias for my beginner students and those looking for a more simple and quick watercolor practice. So grab your brushes, because today we're solving one of watercolor's biggest mysteries: how to keep your colors vibrant, your reds radiant, and your washes full of life. Let's get started. As I start sketching, I want to highlight how important it is to use 100% cotton cold-pressed paper. If you're aiming for vibrant, juicy washes, cotton paper really makes a difference. And cold-pressed finish is especially useful because it stays wet a little bit longer, perfect for the wet-on-wet techniques we will be using. I recommend skipping hot-pressed paper for this project since it dries quickly and can make soft blending more difficult. For the outline, I'm using a hard graphite pencil. This one has a 3H rating. It leaves very light marks. I always sketch gently and try not to erase too much, since erasing can damage the paper and make it harder to get smooth blends later on. You can find a list of all materials I'm using, including this anti-smudge glove, in the video description below. And if you're just starting out, here's some encouragement. You don't need to get it perfect on the first try. Drawing takes practice. Before I painted this large composition, I spent days in my sketchbook doing smaller studies of these claws, testing colors and getting used to the shapes. That warm-up time really helps. It gives you confidence and helps you get to know your subject before moving to the final piece. So be kind to yourself, take your time, and enjoy the process. Every sketch, even the messy one, moves you forward. Now that the outline is complete, it's time for us to start painting, and here's where things get exciting. There are actually many different ways to approach this first color step, and in this tutorial I will show you 3. Watch closely and let me know which one feels right for you. There are no single correct watercolor method. Part of the fun is discovering which technique suits your style best. So on the first lobster claw, I'm starting by adding a touch of green gold to the tip, and I will leave a link to this exact pigment in the video description, but feel free to use any bright yellow. You can also add a hint of green into it if you like. Then I grab some clean water and gently pull that color towards the right, stretching it to complete the shape. From the base of the claw, I will begin layering quinacridone coral. I'm using the Daniel Smith version. Let that red travel up until it softly meets your green gold, and just enjoy how the colors melt into each other. As the paper begins to dry, I will deepen that red with more saturated pigment. To create subtle highlights, I will use a clean, flat brush, blot it on tissue paper to get rid of excess water, and I will lift the paint gently with just the edge. You'll see the color pull back, revealing soft, light areas. Let me show you this same thing from another angle so you can clearly see my brush direction, and then try it yourself. A quick reminder for watercolor beginners, at this stage, we're simply building a light background wash. Everything you see will dry out and look a lot lighter and less vibrant, but still try to keep your paint fairly diluted. Avoid using fully saturated creamy color, or you will lose this beautiful variation in lights and darks. Your paint should be more like a tea consistency. Use plenty of water on your palette and resist the urge to go in too dark too early. Watercolor builds up in transparent layers, and this first one just sets the tone. Now let's try a slightly different technique, and let me know in comments below if you prefer this method better. I start by pre-wetting the shape with clean water, then I drop in green gold near the tip and slowly begin adding my coral again, letting the two meet and blend right on paper. You want to follow the natural direction of the claw with your strokes, from the stem and out towards the tip. This helps any strokes or edges form along the grain of the shape, which gives it a much more organic and natural texture. You can also add a touch of Hooker's green or any of your favorite greens near the tip. Since that yellow-green area is almost dry by now, my Hooker's green is not spreading too far, just enough to give me a soft, textured edge. At this point, I will continue working my way down the stem, skipping every other claw. That way, each shape has room to dry without touching a wet area nearby. This keeps your edges clean and prevents unintended blending. One of the claws below has a fun little detail. It looks like something, maybe a bug, took a tiny little bite, and I'll paint around that spot, then add some Pearland Violet to create a shadowed textured edge. Remember, these little irregularities give your painting character, so don't feel like everything needs to be perfect. The third watercolor approach I'm about to show you skips pre-wetting stage entirely, and it's my favorite. If you've seen my tutorials before, you'll know this is usually how I paint. I go in directly with green gold, then blend into quinacridone coral, letting it stretch all the way across the claw. On the opposite side, I'm gonna do exactly the same thing. No pre-wetting the paper, just start with fairly diluted coral and then finish with your green gold, or maybe you're simply using yellow color, and watch two colors meld together on paper. Once this layer is done, I will lift a few highlights again using a damp brush and just let it dry. This method is fast and intuitive, and yes, the colors will look a bit lighter once dry. But don't worry, drying shift is normal, especially with red pigments, and as long as your mixes are strong and your technique is intentional, you'll still get beautiful results. We'll just need to add another layer, but more on that in a minute. For now, we need to take care of some of these background elements. To finish the inner side of the leaves, all these little parts that are visible, especially on the right-hand side. You can introduce some brown color here. I will be adding just a touch of burnt sienna, very lightly, making it blend into my greens. And here's the final look of the first layer. As you can see, despite using the most vibrant quinacridones, once the water is gone, the leaves end up looking a few shades lighter, and the overall effect is a little less vivid and more flat. And in order to bring it to the next level, here's what we need to do. Give your painting a break, at least a few hours. I try to come back the next day so my paper is bone dry, and I have a good idea of how my blends have blended. Now we can add another coat of paint on top. And I have a few important tips to help you make it more successful. The first thing you want to do is re-wet your surface, once again working one leaf or one lobster claw at a time, but don't overload your paper with too much water. Let me show you on an angle so you can see it clearly. You want your paper surface wet, but not dripping with water. Then it's time to bring back your reds and start adding them gently on the most vibrant parts of the leaf, so some of the highlights remain preserved. You don't want a flat look, you want some good variation in your values, meaning your lights and darks. So drop your extra color on top and then at the bottom, maybe a few strokes in the center, but skip some parts, especially on the tip and in the middle. Also note that I'm introducing a new shade of red here to add some variation in color temperature. This second red I'm using is called Quinacridone Red from Core, and it's actually not red at all. The pigment code is PV19, meaning it's actually pigment violet, and you can find this information about pigment numbers, usually in small print on the back of your tube of paint. So this subtle shift towards blue side of the spectrum provides that extra depth and vividness to my reds. And of course, around the edges, to really accentuate the contrast, you can add your darkest colors. I went with another violet color. This one is called Perlin Violet. It has a very dark mass tone, meaning it almost reads as black when fully concentrated. I will continue working over my first layer of color this way, moving from one red segment to another, always pre-wetting my paper first with clear water, and then dropping my juicy reds and violets, mostly around the silhouette of the shape, but also a little bit in the middle. Because watercolors are transparent, all that background work we did in the beginning, including the lighter highlights I lifted with the flat brush, will remain more or less visible, so we have a good sense of form and three-dimensional shape. But the overall effect with this second coat of color is so much more vivid and vibrant. I hope you're seeing the difference by now as I'm moving up and down the stem, removing the effect of the so-called drying shift with this extra layer of color. I know that one of the trickiest things in watercolor is learning to trust the process. When colors look awkward or dull halfway through, it's really easy to panic. But remember that drying shift happens to everyone, even professionals. The key is to learn how your pigments behave and how to adjust your mixes and timing to compensate for these effects, so you have full control over the result. And for me, layering is the best way to deal with these issues. That's exactly what this tutorial is about. And if you want to dive deeper into how different pigments behave, how to make your colors glow, and how to avoid common watercolor challenges, I go into much more detail in my book 101 Watercolor Secrets. It came out about 5 months ago and has already been called a watercolor Bible by some of you in the reviews, which honestly makes me so happy and so grateful. It's still #1 in art encyclopedias on Amazon, and I truly hope it becomes a trusted companion on your watercolor journey. To add a few finishing touches, I will paint a few extra lines using some burnt sienna just to accentuate the dry edges. And of course, at this stage, you can paint some extra green lines to enhance that detail around the tip of each leaf. I asked you guys on Instagram if you wanted me to add some background elements, and most of you said yes. I actually did try some greenery already with the same lobster claw in my sketchbook. I don't know if this is working for me. I might just add a few leaves around and preserve that white space before editing a full tutorial for my Patreon subscribers. Let me know in comments below what you would like to add here, and if you want to learn more about painting tropical greenery, I highly recommend one of my earlier tutorials featuring a monstera plant. Thank you for watching and painting with me. I will see you soon.